"What the scrolls will tell you," he said, "if you could decipher them, is that we have two human beings, Akasha and Enkil, who had come into Egypt from some other older land. This was in the time long before the first writing, before the first pyramids, when the Egyptians were still cannibals and hunted for the bodies of enemies to eat. Akasha and Enkil directed the people away from these practices. They were worshippers of the good Mother Earth, and they taught the Egyptians how to sow seed in the good Mother, and how to herd animals for meat and milk and skins. In all probability, they were not alone as they taught these things, but rather the leaders of a people who had come with them from older cities, whose names are now lost beneath the sands of Lebanon, their monuments laid waste. Whatever is the truth, these were benevolent rulers, these two, in whom the good of others was the commanding value, as the good Mother was the nourishing mother, and wished for all men to live in peace. And they decided all questions of justice for the emerging land. Perhaps they would have passed into myth in some benign form had it not been for a disturbance in the house of the royal steward, which began with the antics of a demon that hurled the furniture about. Now this was no more than a common demon, the kind one hears of in all lands at all times. He devils those who live in a certain place for a certain while. Perhaps he enters into the body of some innocent and roars through her mouth with a loud voice. He may cause the innocent one to belch obscenities and carnal invitations to those around her. Do you know of these things?" I nodded. I told him you always heard such stories. Such a demon was supposed to have possessed a Vestal Virgin in Rome. She made lewd overtures to all those around her, her face turning purple with exertion, then fainted. But the demon had somehow been driven out. I thought the girl was simply mad, I said, that she was, shall we say, not suited to be a Vestal Virgin? "Of course," he said with a note of rich irony, and I would assume the same thing, and so would most any intelligent man walking the streets of Alexandria above us. Yet such stories come and go, and if they are remarkable for any one thing, it is that they do not affect the course of human events. These demons rather trouble some household, some person, and then they are gone into oblivion, and we are right where we started again. "Precisely," I said. "But you understand this was old Egypt. This was a time when men ran from the thunder, or ate the bodies of the dead to absorb their souls." "I understand," I said. "And this good King Enkil decided that he would himself address the demon who had come into his steward's house. This thing was out of harmony," he said. "The royal magicians begged, of course, to be allowed to see to this, to drive the demon out. But this was a king who would do good for everyone. He had some vision of all things being united in good, of all forces being made to go on the same divine course. He would speak to this demon, try to harness its power, so to speak, for the general good. And only if that could not be done would he consent to the demon's being driven out. And so he went into the house of his steward, where furniture was being flung at the walls, and jars broken and doors slammed, and he commenced to talk to this demon and invite it to talk to him. Everyone else ran away. A full night passed before he came out of the haunted house, and he had amazing things to say. These demons are mindless and childlike, he told his magicians, but I have studied their conduct, and I have learned from all the evidence why it is that they rage. They are maddened that they do not have bodies, that they cannot feel as we feel. They make the innocent scream filth because the rights of love and passion are things that they cannot possibly know. They can work the body parts but not truly inhabit them, and so they are obsessed with the flesh that they cannot invade. And with their feeble powers they bump upon objects. They make their victims twist and jump. This longing to be carnal is the origin of their anger, the indication of the suffering which is their lot." And with these pious words he prepared to lock himself in the haunted chambers to learn more. But this time his wife came between him and his purpose. She would not let him stay with the demons. He must look into the mirror, she said. He had aged remarkably in the few hours that he had remained in the house alone. And when he would not be deterred, she locked herself in with him, and all those who stood outside the house heard the crashing and banging of objects, and feared for the moment when they would hear the king and the queen themselves, screaming or raging in spirit voices. The noise from the inner chambers was alarming. Cracks were appearing in the walls. All fled as before, except for a small party of interested men. Now these men since the beginning of the reign had been the enemies of the king. These were old warriors who had led the campaigns of Egypt in search of human flesh. And they had had enough of the king's goodness, enough of the good mother, and farming, and the like. And they saw in this spirit adventure not only more of the king's vain nonsense, but a situation that nevertheless provided a remarkable opportunity for them. When night fell, they crept into the haunted house. They were fearless of spirits, just as the grave robbers are who rifle the tombs of the pharaohs. They believe, but not enough to control their greed. And when they saw Enkil and Akasha together in the middle of this room, full of flying objects, they set upon them and they stabbed the king over and over, as your Roman senators stabbed Caesar, and they stabbed the only witness, his wife. And the king cried out, "No! Don't you see what you have done? You have given the spirits a way to get in. You have opened my body to them. Don't you see?" But the men fled, sure of the death of the king and the queen, who was on her hands and knees, cradling her husband's head in her hands, both bleeding from more wounds than one could count. Now the conspirators stirred up the populace. Did everyone know that the king had been killed by the spirits, he should have left the demons to his magicians, as any other king would have done. And bearing torches, all flocked to the haunted house, which had grown suddenly and totally quiet. The conspirators urged the magicians to enter, but they were afraid. "Then we will go in and see what's happened," said the evil ones, and they threw open the doors. There stood the king and the queen staring calmly at the conspirators, and all of their wounds were healed, and their eyes had taken on an eerie light, their skin a white shimmer, their hair a magnificent gleam. Out of the house they came as the conspirators ran in terror, and they dismissed all the people and the priests and went back to the palace alone. And though they confided in no one, they knew what had happened to them. They had been entered through their wounds by the demon at the point when mortal life itself was about to escape. But it was the blood that the demon permeated in that twilight moment when the heart almost stopped. Perhaps it was the substance that he had always sought in his ragings, the substance that he had tried to bring forth from his victims with his antics, but he had never been able to inflict enough wounds before his victim died. But now he was in the blood, and the blood was not merely the demon or the blood of the king and queen, but a combination of the human and the demon, which was an altogether different thing. And all that was left of the king and queen was what this blood could animate, what it could infuse and claim for its own. Their bodies were, for all other purposes, dead, but the blood flowed through the brain and through the heart and through the skin, and so the intelligence of the king and queen remained. Their souls, if you will, remained, as the souls reside in these organs, though why we do not know. And though the demon blood had no mind of its own, no character of its own that the king and queen could discover, it nevertheless enhanced their minds and their characters, for it flowed through the organs that create thought, and it added to their faculties its purely spiritual powers, so that the king and queen could hear the thoughts of mortals, and sense things and understand things that mortals could not. In sum, the demon had added, and the demon had taken away, and the king and queen were new things. They could no longer eat food, or grow, or die, or have children. Yet, they could feel with an intensity that terrified them. And the demon had what it wanted, a body to live in, a way to be in the world at last, a way to feel. But then came the even more dreadful discovery, that to keep their corpses animate, the blood must be fed. And all it could convert to its use was the self-same thing of which it was made, blood. Give it more blood to enter, give it more blood to push through the limbs of the body in which it enjoyed such glorious sensations. Of blood it could not get enough. And oh, the grandest of all sensations was the drinking in which it renewed itself, fed itself, enlarged itself. And in that moment of drinking, it could feel the death of the victim, the moment it pulled the blood so hard out of the victim that the victim's heart stopped. The demon had them, the king and queen. They were drinkers of the blood, and whether or not the demon knew of them, we will never be able to tell. But the king and queen knew that they had the demon and could not get rid of it, and if they did, they would die, because their bodies were already dead. And they learned immediately that these dead bodies, animated as they were entirely by this demonic fluid, could not withstand fire or the light of the sun. On the one hand, they seemed as fragile white flowers that can be withered black in the daytime desert heat. On the other, It seemed the blood in them was so volatile that it would boil if heated, thereby destroying the fibers through which it moved. It has been said that in these very early times they could withstand no brilliant illumination, that even a nearby fire would cause their skin to smoke. Whatever, they were of a new order of being, and their thoughts were of a new order of being, and they tried to understand the things that they saw, the dispositions that afflicted them in this new state. All discoveries are not recorded. There is nothing in writing or in the unwritten tradition about when they first chose to pass on the blood, or ascertain the method by which it must be done, that the victim must be drained to the twilight moment of approaching death, or the demonic blood given him cannot take hold. We do know through the unwritten tradition that the king and queen tried to keep secret what had happened to them, but their disappearance by day aroused suspicions. They could not attend to the religious duties in the land, and so it came to pass that even before they had formed their clearest decisions, they had to encourage the populace to a worship of the Good Mother in the light of the moon. But they could not protect themselves from the conspirators, who still did not understand their recovery and sought to do away with them again. The attack came despite all precautions, and the strength of the king and the queen proved overwhelming to the conspirators, and they were all the more frightened by the fact that those wounds they managed to inflict upon the king and the queen were miraculously and instantly healed. An arm was severed from the king, and this he put back on his shoulder, and it came to life again, and the conspirators fled. And through these attacks, these battles, the secret came into the possession not only of the king's enemies, but the priests as well. And no one wanted to destroy the king and the queen now. Rather, they wanted to take them prisoner and gain the secret of immortality from them. And they sought to take the blood from them, but their early attempts failed. The drinkers were not near to death, and so they became hybrid creatures, half god and half human, and they perished in horrible ways. Yet some succeeded. Perhaps they emptied their veins first. It isn't recorded. But in later ages, this has always proved a way to steal the blood. And perhaps the mother and the father chose to make fledglings. Maybe out of loneliness and fear, they chose to pass on the secret to those of good mettle whom they could trust. Again, we are not told. Whatever the case, other drinkers of the blood did come into being, and the method of making them was eventually known. And the scrolls tell us that the mother and the father sought to triumph in their adversity. They sought to find some reason in what had happened, and they believed that their heightened senses must surely serve some good. The good mother had allowed this to happen, had she not? And they must sanctify and contain what was done by mystery, or else Egypt might become a race of blood-drinking demons who would divide the world into those who drink the blood and those who are bred only to give it. A tyranny that once achieved might never be broken by mortal men alone. And so the good king and queen chose the path of ritual, of myth. They saw in themselves the images of the waning and waxing moon, and in their drinking of the blood the God incarnate who takes unto himself his sacrifice, and they used their superior powers to divine and predict and judge. They saw themselves as truly accepting the blood for the God, which otherwise would run down the altar. They girded with the symbolic and the mysterious what could not be allowed to become common, and they passed out of the sight of mortal men into the temples to be worshipped by those who would bring them blood. They took to themselves the most fit sacrifices, those that had always been made for the good of the land, innocents, outsiders, evildoers. They drank the blood for the mother and for the good. They set into motion the tale of Osiris, composed in part of their own terrible suffering, the attack of the conspirators, the recovery, their need to live in the realm of darkness, the world beyond life, their inability to walk any more in sun, and they grafted this upon the older stories of the gods who rise and fall in their love of the good mother, which were already there in the land from which they came. And so these stories came down to us. These stories spread beyond the secret places in which the mother and the father were worshipped, in which those they made with the blood were installed. And they were already old when the first pharaoh built his first pyramid, and the earliest texts record them in broken and strange form. 100 other gods ruled in Egypt, just as they rule in all lands. But the worship of the mother and father and those who drink the blood remains secret and powerful, a cult to which the devoted went to hear the silent voices of the gods, to dream their dreams. We are not told who were the first fledglings of the mother and father. We know only that they spread the religion to the islands of the great sea, and to the lands of the two rivers, and to the north woods, that in shrines everywhere the moon god ruled and drank his blood sacrifices, and used his powers to look into the hearts of men. During the periods between sacrifice and starvation, the god's mind could leave his body. It could travel the heavens. He could learn 1,000 things, and those mortals of the greatest purity of heart could come to the shrine and hear the voice of the god, and he could hear them. But even before my time 1,000 years ago, this was all an old and incoherent story. The gods of the moon had ruled in Egypt for maybe 3,000 years, and the religion had been attacked again and again. When the Egyptian priests turned to the sun god Amun-Ra, they opened the crypts of the moon god and let the sun burn him to cinders. And many of our kind were destroyed. The same happened when the first rude warriors rode down into Greece and broke open the sanctuaries and killed what they did not understand. Now the babbling oracle of Delphi rules where we once ruled. A rid statue stand where we once stood. Our last hour is enjoyed in the north woods whence you came, among those who still drench our altars with the blood of the evildoer, and in the Shah villages of Egypt where 1 or 2 priests tend the god in the crypt, and allow the faithful to bring to him the evildoers, for they cannot take the innocent without arousing suspicion. And of evildoers and outsiders there are always some to be had, and down in the jungles of Africa, near the ruins of old cities that no one remembers, there too we are still obeyed. But our history is punctuated by tales of rogues, the drinkers of the blood, who look to no goddess for guidance, and have always used their powers as they chose. In Rome they live, in Athens, in all cities of the empire. These rogues hearken to no laws of right and wrong, and use their powers for their own ends. And they died horribly in the heat and the flame, just as did the gods in the groves and the sanctuaries. And if any have survived, they probably do not even guess why they were subjected to the killing flame, of how the mother and the father were put into the sun. He had stopped. He was studying my reaction. The library was quiet, and if the others prowled behind the walls, I couldn't hear them anymore. "I don't believe a word of it," I said. He stared at me in stupefied silence for a moment, and then he laughed and laughed. In a rage, I left the library and went out through the temple rooms and up through the tunnel and into the street.